In a quiet suburban neighborhood somewhere in Middle America, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed on weekends and children's laughter floated through the air after school, afternoons often passed without consequence or supervision, and on one such afternoon, Ethan Miller wandered the streets with nothing pressing on his mind beyond boredom. Ethan was 10 years old enough to know rules but young enough not to understand why they mattered, raised in a home where noise was common but guidance was scarce, where adults were present yet rarely attentive. He kicked at loose gravel as he walked, carrying a cheap fishing rod he had found in the garage, the line dragging behind him like an afterthought, when he noticed a dog standing near an empty lot at the edge of the neighborhood. The dog was medium-sized, with dusty fur and tired eyes, clearly a stray, though not a threatening one. Buddy, though no one yet knew his name, stood still, tail low but gently wagging, the way dogs do when they hope more than they fear. To Ethan, the dog was not a living being with hunger and confusion etched into his posture. It was simply something new, something to break the monotony of the afternoon. Curiosity sparked, and curiosity, when left unchecked, often disguises itself as play. Ethan approached without caution, and Buddy did not retreat. He had learned that running rarely brought kindness, and stillness sometimes did. Ethan circled him, laughed to himself and reached out, patting the dog's head in a way that was more possessive than gentle. Buddy accepted the touch because dogs often do, because hope has a way of surviving even after disappointment. Somewhere between that first moment of contact and the next, the idea formed in Ethan's mind, not as cruelty but as entertainment. He had tape in his backpack, left over from a school project, and without much thought, he used it to restrain Buddy's mouth, not tightly enough to cause immediate harm, but firmly enough to silence him. Buddy froze, confusion flashing through his eyes, his body stiffening as instinct told him something was wrong. Yet his trust in humans, battered but not broken, kept him from resisting. Ethan stepped back and laughed, not out of malice but out of the thrill of control, the kind that children discover before they understand responsibility. He tied a small piece of food to the end of the fishing line and dangled it just out of reach, watching as Buddy followed it with his eyes, stepping forward cautiously, hunger overriding fear. Each time Buddy came close, Ethan pulled the line away, giggling as though the moment existed in a world without consequence. To Ethan, this was harmless fun, no different than teasing a friend or chasing a cat from a yard, because no one had ever taught him to pause and imagine what it felt like to be on the other side of the game. Buddy tried again and again, muscles weakening, confusion deepening, the smell of food sharp in his senses, yet unreachable. He could not bark, could not whine, could not communicate distress, and so he did what animals often do when they do not understand pain inflicted by humans. He endured it. His eyes searched Ethan's face not with anger, but with a quiet question, the kind that asks why rather than accuses. But Ethan did not see the question. He saw only movement and reaction, only the brief power of making something respond to him. Time passed quickly in that way childhood time often does, stretching and collapsing without warning, until Ethan grew tired. The novelty faded. The laughter stopped. A sound from down the street, someone calling his name, perhaps his mother reminding him of dinner, broke the spell. Without ceremony or reflection, Ethan reeled in the fishing line, shoved the rod under his arm, and turned away. He did not remove the tape. He did not look back. In his mind, the moment ended the second he lost interest, filed away as another forgettable afternoon. Buddy remained where he was, standing alone at the edge of the lot, the world suddenly quieter and more confusing than before. The neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm, doors opening, cars pulling into driveways, sprinklers clicking on as evening approached, and no one noticed the dog who stood too still, too silent. Children learn many things without words, and Ethan had learned something that day, though not the lesson one might hope. He had learned that his actions faded when he walked away, that discomfort could be ignored if it did not follow him home, that the world did not immediately correct him when he crossed a line. He had not learned cruelty, not consciously, but he had learned indifference, and indifference left to grow often becomes something far more dangerous. Buddy, meanwhile, stood waiting, because waiting was all he had left. He did not understand games or boredom, or the careless nature of a child's curiosity. He understood hunger, confusion, and the fading echo of footsteps that did not return. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, Buddy remained where Ethan had left him, believing, because dogs often do, that humans leave temporarily and come back eventually, unaware that sometimes, the greatest harm is not done by those who intend to hurt, but by those who never stop to consider that their actions matter at all. When the last echo of Ethan's footsteps disappeared and the neighborhood settled back into its familiar rhythm, Buddy was left standing alone, not because he chose to stay, but because his body and instincts told him that moving without purpose could cost more than it gained, and so he remained near the empty lot where the afternoon had unraveled into confusion. The tape across his mouth pressed tighter as time passed, a constant reminder that something essential had been taken from him. Not just the ability to eat freely, but the ability to ask, to call, to explain his presence in a world that had no reason to notice him. As daylight softened and shadows stretched across the pavement, Buddy's hunger grew louder than any sound he could no longer make, a deep, hollow ache that spread slowly through his body, weakening his legs and clouding his thoughts. He took a few uncertain steps down the alley that cut between two rows of houses, its cracked concrete littered with dry leaves and forgotten trash, then stopped, unsure whether leaving the familiar spot would bring help or simply more emptiness. The air carried smells of dinner cooking behind closed doors, warm and unreachable, and Buddy's stomach tightened in response, reminding him of what he lacked. Night came quietly, without ceremony, and the temperature dipped just enough to make the ground uncomfortable beneath his tired body. He curled against the side of a fence, pressing his weight into the wood as if it might offer protection, and closed his eyes in short, restless intervals, waking at every sound, every distant footstep that hinted at possibility. Morning returned, pale and cool, and with it came the faint noises of a waking neighborhood, engines starting, doors opening, voices drifting from somewhere beyond the alley. Buddy lifted his head each time, his ears straining forward, his body tensing with effort, believing, because he had to believe, that one of those sounds might stop near him. People passed at the far end of the alley, silhouettes moving quickly, eyes fixed ahead, schedules already pulling them forward. And though some noticed the dog standing too still, too quiet, none slowed long enough to understand what they were seeing. To them, Buddy was a problem without context, an inconvenience best left to someone else, and so they walked on, telling themselves they would think about it later. Hunger sharpened into weakness as the day wore on, and Buddy ventured only a short distance from the alley, wandering toward a vacant lot where weeds grew tall and the ground was uneven beneath his paws. Each step required intention now, each movement measured because energy had become something to ration carefully. The tape rubbed raw against his fur, and the frustration of being unable to lick or soothe the irritation settled into a dull, constant discomfort. Still, Buddy did not panic. Panic wasted strength. He had learned that much from life on the streets, from nights spent avoiding louder, stronger dogs, from days spent watching humans from a distance, trying to decide which ones were safe. As the second night approached, clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Buddy lowered himself again, tucking his paws close, his breathing shallow and uneven, his body fighting to hold on to warmth. Rain came in the early hours, cold and steady, soaking into his fur and turning the dirt beneath him into mud. Water ran along his face, stinging his eyes, and he shifted weakly, trying to keep his head above the pooling ground. The rain did not stop, and neither did the world. Cars passed nearby, their tires hissing against wet pavement, splashing water into the gutter, and Buddy flinched at the sudden noise, his heart racing, his body instinctively shrinking inward. When morning came again, it arrived gray and unwelcoming, and Buddy's strength had faded further, his once alert posture replaced by a weary stillness that spoke of endurance stretched thin. He moved back toward the neighborhood, not because it offered comfort, but because it was familiar, and familiarity felt safer than the unknown beyond. Children walked past on their way to school, backpacks bouncing, conversations overlapping, and a few glanced his way, curiosity flickering briefly before being swallowed by routine. An older man slowed, frowned, and shook his head, muttering something Buddy could not hear, before continuing on, his concern dissolving into the distance. By the third day, Buddy's body felt lighter in a way that frightened him, his steps unsteady, his vision occasionally blurring at the edges. Yet every morning when the sound of footsteps reached him, he lifted his head. Every time. Hope did not fade with hunger. It did not weaken with exhaustion. It simply waited, quiet and insistent, insisting that someone eventually would notice what others had not. Buddy did not understand why people looked away, only that they did, And he did not blame them, because blame required an understanding of intention that lay beyond him. He knew only that staying near the neighborhood meant staying near people, and staying near people meant staying close to the possibility of help. On the fourth day, the rain returned, colder this time, driven by wind that cut through his thin coat, and Buddy pressed himself against the side of a building, shivering, his muscles trembling with fatigue. The world felt distant now, as though it were happening somewhere just beyond his reach, muffled and blurred. Still, when footsteps approached, he looked up. Still, when voices passed nearby, he listened. Somewhere in his memory lived the faint impression of kindness, a hand that had once rested gently on his head, a voice that had once spoken without anger, and that memory, fragile as it was, held him upright when his body wanted to collapse. He waited because waiting was all he had left, and because giving up would mean letting go of the belief that his life mattered to anyone at all. In alleys and empty lots and quiet streets where people hurried past, Buddy's silent endurance stretched on, held together by a single stubborn truth. Sometimes hope is not loud or dramatic, but it is powerful enough to keep a living being breathing, one uncertain moment at a time. The morning arrived quietly, carried in on cool air and the soft light of early hours, and for Buddy it began like the mornings before it, with stiffness in his limbs, dryness in his throat, and a familiar heaviness that made lifting his head feel like an act of will rather than instinct. He had not slept much. Sleep came in fragments now, interrupted by hunger and the discomfort of the tape still pressed against his mouth, a constant reminder of how long it had been since he had eaten properly or made a sound. The neighborhood was waking again, just as it always did, with engines starting and doors opening, with people stepping out of their homes and into routines they had repeated so many times they no longer thought about them. Buddy watched from near the sidewalk that led toward the bus stop, his body tucked close to a low fence, his fur dulled by dirt and rain, his eyes tired but alert. He had learned the rhythm of the street over the past days, learned when people were most likely to pass and when the world grew quieter, and something in him understood that mornings brought more chances than afternoons ever did. When the first footsteps approached, he lifted his head. When the next followed, he lifted it again. Most passed without slowing, their attention already elsewhere, but Buddy did not lower his gaze. Hope had become a habit now, as automatic as breathing and just as necessary. Sarah Thompson was already thinking about her day when she turned onto the familiar route that led her to the bus stop. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, long enough for the streets to feel like an extension of her home, long enough to notice small changes without consciously looking for them. That morning, she noticed something was wrong before she fully understood what it was. There was a shape near the sidewalk that did not move the way it should have, a stillness that felt out of place against the steady flow of morning movement. She slowed without realizing she was doing it, her steps shortening, her attention drifting from her phone to the figure ahead. When she saw the dog, she stopped. Buddy looked up at her, and in that moment there was no drama, no sudden rush of movement or desperate attempt to get closer. He did not lunge or whine. He simply looked. His eyes met hers with a quiet steadiness that held no accusation and no expectation, only a patient waiting that seemed to have been worn smooth by time. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not even shock, but recognition. She had seen that look before, in shelters and on streets, in creatures that had learned not to waste energy begging from a world that often refused to listen. She took a few careful steps closer and noticed the tape, worn and dirty now, holding Buddy's mouth closed in a way that was neither neat nor accidental. The sight made her inhale sharply, anger flaring briefly before being replaced by something steadier and more useful. Kneeling down, she moved slowly, aware that sudden gestures could frighten an animal already stretched thin by exhaustion. Buddy did not pull away. He stayed very still, trusting not because he knew her, but because he had nothing left to lose by doing so. Sarah peeled the tape away gently, pausing when Buddy flinched, murmuring soft sounds meant more to soothe than to communicate anything specific. When the tape finally came free, Buddy's mouth opened slightly, his jaw stiff, his breath uneven, and he licked his lips instinctively, relief washing over his face in a way that was impossible to miss. Sarah reached out and rested her hand against his head, feeling the roughness of his fur, the heat of a body that had been fighting the elements for days. She did not rush. She did not speak much. She let her presence be calm and steady, letting Buddy decide what he could handle. From her bag, She pulled out a small portion of food she had packed for herself, breaking it into pieces and setting them carefully on the ground within his reach. Buddy hesitated only briefly before lowering his head and eating, slowly at first, then with more urgency as his body remembered what nourishment felt like. Sarah watched him, her schedule tugging at the back of her mind, the bus timetable pressing forward without regard for what she had just encountered. She checked the time, then looked back at Buddy, weighing decisions that felt far larger than they should have been for an ordinary Tuesday morning. She stroked his head again, her touch light, reassuring, and though her words were quiet, almost lost to the sounds of the street, her intention was clear. She would come back. After work. She would not leave him like this. Buddy listened, not to the words themselves but to the tone, to the steadiness behind them, to the way Sarah looked at him as if he were something that mattered. When she stood, hesitating for a moment before stepping away, Buddy's eyes followed her, tracking her movement until distance made her features blur into the rest of the morning crowd. She glanced back once, meeting his gaze again, and something passed between them that did not need language to exist. Then she turned and walked toward the bus stop, blending back into the flow of commuters, carrying with her the weight of a promise that felt heavier than any bag on her shoulder. Buddy remained where he was, his body weak but lighter now, his stomach no longer completely empty, his mouth free for the first time in days. He did not chase after her. He did not wander away. He stayed. The world felt different now, subtly but unmistakably changed. The street was the same, the sounds unchanged, but the waiting no longer felt endless. There was a shape to it, a direction. For the rest of the morning Buddy rested, conserving his strength, lifting his head when footsteps approached but no longer searching every face with the same urgency. He had been seen. That knowledge settled into him like warmth, spreading slowly, pushing back against the cold uncertainty that had defined his days. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. People continued to move through the neighborhood, unaware that something fragile and important had been set in motion. Buddy did not know what a promise was in the way humans did not understand schedules or obligations or the thousand small things that could prevent someone from returning. He knew only that a person had stopped, had touched him with care, had removed his pain, and had looked at him as though his presence carried weight. That was enough. As the day unfolded and the morning gave way to afternoon, Buddy waited, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he believed that sometimes when someone looks at you the way Sarah had looked at him, walking away is no longer an option. The afternoon faded slowly, almost reluctantly, as Buddy remained in the same spot near the sidewalk, his body stretched out against the familiar patch of ground, the place now marked not by pain but by a fragile sense of purpose. The warmth of the sun that had crept across the pavement earlier in the day began to withdraw, replaced by cooler air that settled into his bones, and though his stomach was no longer completely empty, weakness still lingered in every movement he made. He shifted only when he had to, careful not to waste what little strength he had regained, lifting his head now and then as people passed, watching the light change, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood as they softened into evening. Cars returned home one by one, engines humming briefly before falling silent, doors closing, voices drifting through open windows before being shut out by walls and curtains. Buddy noticed these things in the way animals do, without judgment, only awareness, marking the passing of time through patterns rather than clocks. As the sky darkened, clouds gathered overhead, thick and heavy, pressing low as if the day itself were growing tired. The first drops of rain fell quietly, barely noticeable at first, tapping against leaves and pavement, and Buddy flinched instinctively, memories of cold nights stirring within him. He rose slowly and repositioned himself closer to the fence, the same place that had offered a small measure of shelter before, and settled back down, tucking his legs beneath his body, bracing himself for what he sensed was coming. Rain intensified quickly, the gentle tapping turning into a steady drumming that soaked into his fur and darkened the ground beneath him. Water ran along the curb, reflecting the yellow glow of streetlights that flickered on one by one, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet sidewalk. Buddy shivered, his muscles tightening in response to the cold, his body fighting to hold on to warmth as the temperature dropped. Each minute felt heavier than the last, the hours stretching thin, and though he told himself nothing in words, something deep inside him began to question whether waiting was still the right choice. The memory of Sarah's touch, the steadiness in her eyes, flickered like a small flame in the wind, bright but vulnerable. Time passed. The street grew quieter, traffic thinning until only the occasional car hissed by, tires slicing through puddles, spraying water into the air. Buddy lifted his head each time, heart quickening, only to watch the car disappear down the road, taillights fading into the rain. His hope did not vanish all at once. It weakened gradually, bending under the weight of exhaustion and cold, stretched thinner with every passing moment that brought no sign of return. Still he did not leave. Leaving felt like a betrayal of the one thing that had kept him alive these past days. And so he stayed, rain soaking through his coat, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the path Sarah had taken that morning. The neighborhood, once busy and loud, now felt distant and hollow, as though the world had narrowed to this small wet stretch of pavement and the quiet figure waiting upon it. Buddy's breathing grew shallow, his eyelids heavy, and for a brief moment, he lowered his head, resting it against the ground, surrendering to the idea that perhaps this was as far as hope could carry him. Then he heard footsteps. They were different from the hurried steps of commuters or the careless rush of passers-by. These were slower, uneven, accompanied by the soft splash of shoes against water. Buddy's head lifted again, effort trembling through his neck, his vision blurred by rain and fatigue. At first, the figure was only a shape beneath a streetlight, blurred by distance and falling water, and Buddy hesitated, afraid of letting himself believe too quickly. The shape moved closer, resolving into a familiar outline, shoulders hunched against the rain, hair plastered to a face he recognized before he fully understood how. Sarah walked toward him, soaked through, her coat darkened by water, her steps purposeful despite the weather. The moment stretched, suspended between doubt and relief, until she was close enough that Buddy could see her clearly, could feel the warmth of her presence cutting through the cold. Something inside him gave way then, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet release that left him sagging with exhaustion rather than fear. Sarah knelt beside him without hesitation, rain soaking into her clothes as she reached for him, her hands firm and gentle, reassuring in a way that needed no explanation. She checked him quickly, her movements efficient yet careful, concern etched into her face as she took in his condition, the way his body shook, the way his strength seemed to be held together by sheer will. She did not scold the rain or curse the delay. She simply acted. With a soft murmur meant only to calm, she slid her arms beneath Buddy's body and lifted him, surprised by how light he felt, how easily he fit into her grasp. Buddy did not resist. He leaned into her, trusting completely now, his head resting weakly against her shoulder, rain dripping from his fur onto her sleeve. The world shifted as Sarah stood, the ground moving away, replaced by the steady rhythm of her steps as she carried him toward her car. Streetlights passed overhead, one by one, their glow blurring into streaks of yellow against the dark sky, and Buddy closed his eyes, not in fear, but in relief so deep it bordered on disbelief. The rain continued to fall, cold and unyielding, but it no longer mattered. The waiting was over. Sarah placed him gently into the back seat, arranging a towel around him, her movements quick but careful, and when she closed the door, Buddy felt something he had not felt in a long time: safety. The car filled with the sound of rain against metal, the engine starting, warmth slowly seeping into the space around him as they pulled away from the curb. Buddy's body relaxed inch by inch, tension draining from muscles that had been clenched for days, and though his eyes remained half-closed, his awareness lingered, taking in the unfamiliar comfort, the steady hum of motion, the knowledge that he was no longer alone. Sarah drove through wet streets toward her home, headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying with her not just a rescued dog, but the quiet confirmation that promises, when kept, could still mean something. For Buddy, the world had narrowed again. But this time it narrowed around warmth, shelter, and the simple, extraordinary fact that someone had come back. Trust, fragile and easily broken, had been tested by cold rain and long hours of doubt, and in the end it had been answered. In that answer, small and unremarkable to anyone else passing by, lay something close to a miracle, born not of grand gestures, but of a single person who chose to return when it would have been easier not to. Sarah's house was small, the kind of modest place that blended quietly into the neighborhood without drawing attention to itself, but to Buddy it felt larger than anything he had ever known. The warmth inside wrapped around him the moment Sarah carried him through the door, replacing the cold that had lived in his bones for days with a steady, unfamiliar comfort. The floors were clean, the air smelled faintly of soap and something warm cooking in the kitchen, and for a long moment Buddy simply lay where Sarah placed him, unsure whether moving would somehow undo the safety he had just gained. His body was exhausted beyond protest, his muscles slack with relief, and when sleep came, it came deeply, without fear, carrying him into a darkness free of hunger and rain. When he woke, the world felt different. Light filtered softly through curtains. The air was still. There were no passing cars, no footsteps hurrying by, no reason to lift his head in constant alert. Sarah moved quietly around the room, giving him space, watching without hovering, allowing him to exist without expectation. It was then that Buddy noticed Max. Max stood a short distance away, calm and steady, his posture relaxed, his eyes curious but not suspicious. He was older, larger, his coat well kept, the look of a dog who knew where he belonged. Buddy tensed instinctively, memories of territorial encounters stirring faintly, but Max did not challenge him. He simply sat and waited, tail moving slowly, as if offering patience rather than dominance. Over the next hours, the distance between them closed naturally, not through force or fear, but through quiet observation. Max approached first, sniffing carefully, then retreating, giving Buddy time to adjust. Buddy responded in kind, cautious but willing, and before long, the tension eased into something gentler. They shared space without conflict, then water, then food, and by the end of the day, they rested near one another, two shapes breathing in the same calm rhythm. Recovery did not come quickly, but it came steadily. Buddy's body began to respond to regular meals, to clean water, to rest that was uninterrupted by worry. His strength returned in small increments, his ribs slowly disappearing beneath new weight, his eyes growing brighter as the fog of exhaustion lifted. Just as important was the healing that took place quietly inside him, the slow rebuilding of trust that had been worn thin but not destroyed. He learned the sounds of the house, the way floors creaked at night, the hum of appliances, the rhythm of Sarah's routine. He learned that hands could reach out without causing harm, that voices could exist without shouting, that silence could mean peace rather than danger. Max became his guide in this new world, showing him where to sleep, how to ask to go outside, how to wait patiently by the door. They played together in short bursts at first, Buddy's energy limited, but laughter, the silent kind dog's share, returned to him nonetheless. Weeks passed, marked by routine and small victories, until one morning Sarah clipped leashes onto both collars and led them out toward the nearby park. The air was cool and clear, the grass damp with dew, and Buddy walked beside Max, attentive but relaxed, his steps no longer tentative. The park was alive with quiet activity, joggers moving past, children playing in the distance, families gathering beneath trees, and Buddy took it all in without fear, comforted by Max's presence and Sarah's steady pace. It was near the edge of the park that Buddy noticed the boy. Recognition came not as panic, but as a tightening deep in his chest, a memory rising unbidden from a place he had hoped to leave behind. Ethan stood with his parents a short distance away, laughing, his movements careless, unchanged. His voice carried easily, light and unconcerned, and his parents smiled, distracted, engaged more with each other than with the scene unfolding around them. Buddy slowed. Max sensed the shift immediately, glancing toward him, confused by the sudden tension. Buddy did not bark. He did not growl or pull forward. He did not seek confrontation or revenge. Instead, he stepped closer to Max and gently pressed against him, nudging him to the side, away from the path that would bring them closer to the boy. It was a simple movement, quiet and deliberate, guided not by fear, but by an instinct to avoid what had once caused pain. Sarah noticed the change at once. She followed Buddy's gaze, saw Ethan, and understood more than the situation alone explained. Her expression hardened briefly, not with anger, but with a deeper awareness, the kind that settles when patterns become clear. She did not stop to confront the boy or his parents. She did not raise her voice or demand accountability. Instead, she tightened her grip on the leashes slightly and guided both dogs in a gentle arc away from the family, her movements calm and decisive. As they walked on, the sounds of laughter faded behind them, swallowed by distance and the rustle of leaves overhead. Buddy glanced back only once, then turned his attention forward again, his steps steady, his body relaxed. He had learned something important, though not in words. He had learned that survival did not require confrontation, that peace could be chosen even when pain was remembered. Sarah walked on with them, her thoughts heavy but controlled, aware that some lessons were not hers to teach, and some changes could not be forced. She knew that Ethan might grow up unchanged, that indifference left unchallenged often followed children into adulthood. She also knew that Buddy's story could have ended differently, that timing and choice had played fragile roles in shaping this moment. At home, Buddy and Max settled into their familiar places, the house welcoming them back without ceremony. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, meals served on time, walks taken in gentle weather, evenings spent resting together in shared warmth. Buddy had been saved not by force, but by someone who chose to stop and return. Yet the world beyond Sarah's home remained full of unseen corners, alleys and empty lots where others still waited without voices, lifting their heads at passing footsteps, believing against all evidence that someone might notice. Ethan walked away that day unchanged, perhaps unaware of what he had once done, perhaps unconcerned with what he had left behind. Whether he would ever learn was a question without an answer. Buddy's life had turned toward safety and companionship, but his story did not close the door on all the others still waiting. And so the park returned to its normal calm, the laughter and movement blending back into the landscape, leaving behind a quiet truth that lingered long after the footsteps faded. Kindness does not always announce itself, does not always demand recognition or justice, but when it appears even once, it can change the direction of a life, while the absence of it continues unseen, shaping countless others still hoping for a reason not to give up.